We've spent a lot of Cardano's existence talking about launch, the launch of Shelley, the launch of Alonzo, the launch of DeFi, the launch of Vasil, and the launch of thousands of individual projects. But we haven't talked a lot about what happens next after the space station is already in orbit and the astronauts have already done their first spacewalks. Now we've got to think longer term. How do we keep the space station running? How do we keep the astronauts fed? Do we keep building onto DeFi orbiters 1 through 5 forever? Or will it be an endless stream of launches forever? As Metaverse projects terraform these virtual worlds with land cells, they're flush with funds. But what does development look like when those funds are gone? Now we've got to start thinking longer term in Cardano. Ready? Let's go. Today, we're going to discuss some of these issues of long-term sustainability, not just of Cardano systemically, but also of individual projects. And in that context, we'll discuss Charles's recent lobbying trip to DC, complete with a pretty disturbing discovery, and then we'll talk long-term about DeFi and Metaverse projects. If you were horrified at this imagery when you first saw it because you know that astronauts are not supposed to be floating around in space, not connected to anything, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. When we're thinking about Cardano in the long term, we unfortunately still have to think about systemic existential issues. This has always been the case for crypto. We always had to think about this issue. Will my government, ex-government, will they wake up tomorrow and try to ban crypto? This has happened off and on in certain countries for years. They just banned crypto. Now crypto's unbanned. Now crypto's banned and now crypto's unbanned. We've always had to worry about this happening in bigger Western countries as well. Would the policymakers in that country wake up and decide crypto is too big a threat to the interests of their central bank, to the interests of their financial sector, to somebody's interests, and figure out some way to either outright or effectively ban crypto? This has always been a concern. But we also have to worry about different sectors that Cardano might fall into, different sectors of crypto being banned, not even all of crypto. We still have to worry about all of crypto suffering some kind of regulatory setback, but we also have to worry about just certain parts of crypto suffering a setback, like we found out from Charles's recent update from Washington. So Charles took a delegation of people to Washington to basically do some lobbying. They've been meeting with various advocacy groups along with staff of the House and the Senate. If you're not from the US, those are both arms of the bicameral legislative branch of the US. And also people at various agencies like the CFTC. After all those meetings, Charles says he can cite 3 big areas of activity right now in crypto in Washington. Number 1 is the Digital Commodities Exchange Act. This would change the treatment of ICOs and token trading to create more clarity and push everything toward a commodities type treatment rather than a securities treatment. This would mean things would fall more under the purview of the CFTC and less so under the SEC. I think this would be a great move for crypto if we could somehow pull that off. It sort of gets us out of the murkiness of securities law. Securities law, as we've discussed many times in this channel, was at least the foundations of modern securities law were formulated too long ago. We've got 2 big acts, the 33 Act and the 34 Act, so named because they're from 1933 and 1934. How much do you want anything made in 1933 and 1934 to be the foundations for the regulation of something as modern as cryptocurrencies? It's too old-fashioned, too long ago. The paradigms are from a forgotten, bygone era that can't possibly cope with the complexities of, the digital age, let alone cryptocurrencies. As great as that sounds, Charles says the Digital Commodities Exchange Act is unlikely to pass in its current form, but it's starting a good conversation about commodities regulation of crypto versus securities regulation of crypto. The number two big area, this is the one that I'm probably most excited for, is the Lummis-Gillibrand bill. You'll remember we've talked about this many times. We've known about this bill for a long time. Apparently, that'll hit around June 7th. We knew it was coming next month. It sounds like around June 7th, we'll actually get a look at this bill. This is a true comprehensive crypto bill. Drafts Charles has seen are 140 pages long. And Charles mentioned a lot of different topical areas, including taxes, self regulatory organizations, notions of commodities and securities, and sufficient decentralization. This sufficient decentralization thing is something that Charles got into in quite a bit more detail a little bit later. This bill is bipartisan with senators coming from both sides of the aisle, Lummis and Gillibrand. So it actually has some traction to actually spark some debate in the Senate. Unfortunately, it would have to survive 4 separate committees, so unlikely to pass in its current form as well. You're noticing a trend here. We have these areas of activity, these initiatives, and sometimes they even sound good. And Washington, so bureaucratic, so difficult, so contentious, so much conflict. It's almost impossible for anybody to pass anything, even if it makes perfect sense. The third area of activity is the Biden executive order. So we've covered this many times on the channel. First reports on the Biden executive order are due in June if they're not delayed. Charles thinks these 3 areas of activity will probably collide with each other if Washington has sufficient will to act on crypto right now. But we've also got midterm elections in November. That means, and I think Charles is correct here in sort of expecting that we might see um, significant change in the party membership of the people holding those seats in Congress. So we could end up once again with a divided legislative branch and executive branch, in which case, and if Washington does have sufficient will to act on crypto right now, we would have to end up with some kind of a compromise agreement representing the views of sort of both parties, kind of the views behind the Biden executive order, and probably something very different. We'll just say something very, without making this partisan, something very different from the opposite party there. So that's sort of Charles's appraisal of what's actually happening in Washington. The next question is, what is he actually lobbying for? What is he trying to make happen? He says he thinks crypto needs 3 big things. These are a definition of decentralization, a user bill of rights in crypto, and some treatment of the transnational nature of crypto. So when he says definition of decentralization, he is really saying we don't have a standard definition. That means projects can misuse the word decentralization, and this causes people to misallocate time and money. It also creates confusion around attempts to create definitions of things like securities and commodities in crypto, because these definitions naturally sort of revolve around decentralization, but nobody means the same thing when they're saying decentralization. Charles's answer to this is that Cardano is going to get together with the University of Edinburgh to create a lab to foster the Edinburgh Decentralization Index to measure the top 20 crypto projects in reference to Bitcoin in terms of decentralization. This is an attempt to create a standard of decentralization that can be codified in these definitions of securities and commodities, for example. I think this is probably the next step we have to have. If we don't, this definition of decentralization is going to, if we don't have an objective standard, if it's a subjective standard and projects can continue claiming to be decentralized when they're not. I think all of us in Cardano can say that certain projects are certainly not decentralized, at least compared to Cardano. A lot of projects aren't compared to Cardano. But if every project continues using this label decentralization, and we have many more Luna 1.0 implosions, if we have many more implosions like that, and these projects continue saying we're decentralized, regulation will surely come. There's no question about that. And it will be, I think, a much worse scenario for crypto generally than if we have some objective standards about decentralization. And we can say, well, yeah, we've had some Luna style implosions, but not with the decentralized projects. These kinds of things tend to happen with the more centralized projects. I think there's a lot of progress we can make on that front. Number two thing Charles is pushing for is a user bill of rights in crypto. He says if, for example, something is billed as open source and free, there's an implicit promise that the developer won't wake up the next day and say, okay, now you have to pay for this thing. You have to pay a fee to use this thing, even though you first invested maybe your time and efforts in it to use it because we were originally labeling it as open source. This is just an implicit promise. These kinds of things aren't codified anywhere. Charles thinks we need system-wide constitutions that provide guarantees about things like consumer protection, privacy, and software quality. The last item that Charles is pushing for revolves around this observation that these crypto markets are transnational. We as a crypto community need to adopt certain standards and principles that are global norms applicable every year. It won't really work if just one country adopts the right concepts. Even if we get one country or one group of countries to adopt the right concepts, if these things aren't adopted as international global norms, then we still have this race to the bottom situation where projects are just going to seek out domicile in the jurisdictions with the worst regulations that allow them to manipulate the users and do all of these things that we don't really want them to do. Going forward, Charles says he's going to continue working with the crypto groups that are presently in Washington, D.C., and he'll continue commenting on crypto bills as he's given the opportunity to do that. He says there's still a big knowledge gap with some policymakers. They still don't focus on much beyond the market cap of each project. Obviously, that's not everybody in Washington or all the policymakers, but he says largely a lot of policymakers, they kind of know the relative market cap of the big projects, but maybe not a lot beyond that. They don't really understand the nuance behind what different blockchains do. Charles predicts that if we see some progress on regulation in the next 6 to 12 months, and this is not necessarily going to match your definition of progress. He's saying if Washington is actually able to make some progress on passing some regulation, good or bad, it will probably be on asset-backed stablecoins. This, of course, is not at all a surprise. If you look at the rhetoric that we've covered on this channel coming out of regulators and policymakers in DC, stablecoins is one of their biggest areas of concern, and you can understand why they would attack asset-backed stablecoins first as opposed to algorithmic stablecoins, because asset-backed stablecoins have assets that they can regulate. Here's the disturbing part that could be sort of systemically existential for Cardano specifically. Charles also revealed that he saw emails and messages where certain Bitcoin maximalists were making every attempt to sort of corrupt the legislative process and get language included in bills that virtually every crypto project other than Bitcoin is a security, and to regulate or ban proof of stake cryptocurrencies. Obviously, Charles was super disappointed in this, as I'm sure many of you are hearing it. And he says it's a terrible, I think he's thinking of it as sort of a terrible affront to the libertarian principles of crypto. Certainly, when you read the Satoshi white paper, you don't think, okay, this is a great foundation for a brand new economic system. We should also try to go forward and ban any competitors to this system. I don't think those are the kinds of libertarian principles that Satoshi had in mind when he was writing that white paper and creating the Bitcoin protocol. But apparently some Bitcoin maximalists today, they're not playing by this same rule book. I see a lot of people on crypto Twitter saying like, oh, we shouldn't criticize Bitcoin. Like, don't criticize Bitcoin's energy consumption. Don't criticize anything about Bitcoin because it's bad for the whole space. Some Bitcoin maximalists are not playing from the same rule book where nobody criticizes anything else in crypto. You should be aware. Some Bitcoin maximalists would very happily do the Thanos finger snap where they snap their fingers and no other cryptocurrency exists. And if they can do that through influencing policymakers in Washington, D.C., they're also happy to do that, as we have discovered from Charles and these emails and messages he's seen. He says, I mean, these aren't like random, anonymous messages. These are Bitcoin maximalists whose names he knows. He saw the actual messages from these people trying to convince policymakers to ban proof of stake cryptocurrencies. He says this is obviously not very effective. While Washington may be a very bureaucratic place, I think we can all agree that it's not a place full of idiots. People in Washington tend to understand when they're being lobbied, and they understand that these types of Bitcoin maximalists are certainly going to be acting on their own interests and not necessarily the interests of the wider crypto space. But regulatory predation of the entire ecosystem, or even all of proof of stake, isn't the only thing we have to worry about. We also have to worry about the long-term sustainability of individual projects. Here's the CardanoCube.io ecosystem map of a bunch of our Cardano DeFi projects. So a lot of people are holding various types of assets related to these DeFi projects, and everybody's waiting for these projects to launch. Vasil's finally coming next month, SIPs 31 through 33, and a lot of these projects are going to finally have the features and tools they need to launch. It'll probably, it'll take them, I'm sure, some amount of time. There's going to be this transition period where they try to build some of these tools into their platforms. So it's not like an off-on switch. We've talked about that before. It's not like things are instantly going to happen as soon as Vasil happens. But at some point after Vasil, a lot of these projects are going to have what they need to actually launch. And people have been hodling like crazy because they can't wait for the various, ways in which they're going to make money in these projects based on these assets they've been hodling. There's all kinds of talk about various yields. If you hold this token or if you hold that token, and you're going to lock up this asset to earn this asset, all kinds of very complex stuff. We talked a little bit already about Ponzi-nomics in crypto DeFi in general. And I think there is some level of Ponzi-nomics that goes on in the DeFi scene in every single blockchain. This discussion is not necessarily about that. It's more about what it looks like in these projects long term. Because one of the things a lot of crypto projects, including DeFi projects, tend to have in common is that the founding teams, the people actually building the project, the way they're remunerating themselves is by giving themselves some of the tokens of the project. It's sort of like this one-time lump sum thing. They're like, hey, here's the old pie chart of who owns what in this project. And we, the team, are keeping whatever percent, 10%, 15%, 20%. They're keeping some percentage of the project. And then there's always some kind of lockup period. There's this timeline. It's like, okay, the team may hold 1 out of every 5 tokens or whatever it is, but they can't actually sell any for X amount of time. 1 year, 1.5 years, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is. There's some period of time their coins are locked up. They cannot sell their coins. And then you've got these periods. It's like in the first 6 months after that, they can sell this percentage of their coins. And then in the next 6-month period, they can sell this percentage, or sometimes it's by a month. But whatever it is, there's some kind of a lockup period where the team is not allowed to sell their coins. But that doesn't mean that the team is never going to sell their coins. We wouldn't have to have lockup periods if the teams were all just like hardcore hodlers. I don't think anybody's expecting that. Nobody's expecting that the team will just keep their coins forever because the project's so wonderful they don't want to sell their coins. The teams behind these projects have bills too. They need to pay those bills. So we can expect that teams are going to sell their token ownership. This is often only compounded by the emission schedule of the governance tokens. If you do certain things, like we talked about in the Ponzi-nomics discussion, if you do certain things in the platform, then the platform will emit these governance tokens. And there's usually some kind of an issuance schedule. And a lot of times it looks a little bit like the lockup period for the team over the course of X number of months. Sometimes it's 36 months, 18 months, 24 months, whatever it is, 12 months. They're going to continue to reward you with this governance token if you do certain things within the platform. But then at a certain point, that kind of ends or it trails off really heavily. So the the emissions of that governance token go way, way, way down. And oftentimes that kind of corresponds, it's kind of contemporaneous with the period over which the executive team and the team behind the project are no longer locked up. So it seems like logically we should be asking the question, what do these platforms look like once the heightened issuances of those governance tokens dries up, once that goes away, and especially if that's kind of contemporaneous with the lockup period of the team, which might hold 20% of the tokens, one out of every 5 tokens might be held by the team. If their lockup period ends and the platform is no longer executing on these heavy emissions of the governance tokens, what does the platform look like then? I don't see people asking that question too often, which makes me think that people just aren't thinking that far ahead, or people are thinking about these projects only on a shorter timeline, and it's all short-term planning, and they're just planning on jumping on to the next project once those end dates arrive. Obviously, these emission schedules of these governance tokens and these lockup periods of the teams are sort of built around this paradigm of a project building out a protocol and then deploying that protocol once on the blockchain, and then the protocol just kind of running on the blockchain forever. And we certainly have a history of this in the EVM world. That's what's happened. These DeFi protocols get built out, deployed, and then the blockchain does what the blockchain is supposed to do. It just runs that protocol forever. And of course, we have to build sort of around that reality in crypto, that things can be deployed and the blockchain will do its thing on a decentralized basis. It'll just run the protocol forever. I'm just pointing out there's a gap in the short-term environment in which these protocols sort of operate, when they've got all these governance tokens being issued and the team is under lockup, and then all of a sudden those things end. There's an end date to both of those things, or at least they're like significantly diminished, both the lockup and the issuance of the governance tokens. In a lot of cases, not all cases, of course, but then there's this other environment after those things. And we don't usually talk about that second environment. We just sort of pretend like the only thing that matters is that first environment before those periods end. And of course, there's also a lot of head nodding towards governance, but how much effective governance actually takes place down the road is also an open question. But this doesn't just apply to DeFi projects. It actually applies to all kinds of crypto projects. And with Metaverse projects, it might create some different kinds of issues, because with Metaverse projects, what we typically see is a big NFT sell sort of right at the beginning of the project. They tend to sell off a whole bunch of digital real estate and maybe some other kinds of NFTs that have to do with their virtual world. And then it's sort of the end of revenue. Not totally. A lot of projects have, different features within the virtual world that theoretically are going to create some kind of revenue for the user of some kind of in-game currency or something. But you see a lot of these big land sales, and a lot of them have produced a lot of funds for these projects, huge amount of funds, and they're sort of flush with cash right at the beginning of the project. But those funds too will run out at some point. And with the Metaverse projects, it's kind of unclear. It's like, hey, they're going to make certain assurances to the community. Hey, buy these Metaverse parcels and we're going to build out this great project. Here's all the things the project's going to have. But no matter what amount of money they raise in their digital land sales, at some point that money runs out. And it's the same thing as we observe with these DeFi projects. With the DeFi projects, though, there's always this kind of like there's this idea of theoretical revenue being produced by the machines that these DeFi platforms create. With the Metaverse projects, it's a little bit less clear what happens when the money actually runs out from the land sales. With some Metaverse projects, maybe they have these concepts of unlimited land, and maybe they could just keep expanding their map and selling more and more. With other projects, you've got kind of a cap on the amount of land. But with the with the additional sale of additional land, you've got issues of dilution of the original landholders, if this is, anything that those landholders are concerned about. So the initial landholders may not want the map to expand in the case of a lot of these metaverses because they might see it as dilution of their holdings of the initial lands. And, with some of these metaverses, they're planning on incorporating these, little revenue creating mechanisms. So the initial landholders may be perfectly happy doing whatever it is they're doing on these initial land holdings, whether it's, you know, production of little assets to be used within the game, minerals, metals, farming various commodities, whatever they're doing in these metaverses. The initial landholders are going to be pretty content to just stay on their lands they bought in the initial land sell. It's a little bit different than the video game world, where we see these video game franchises and they know, like every year or every couple of years, they're going to come out with a brand new version of the video game, and all of the users are going to be perfectly happy to jump to the new version. It's like, oh, in the last version, we were in ancient Greece. In the next version, you're a Viking. Almost everybody, is going to jump from having been in ancient Greece to the Viking world because they don't have this kind of financial investment. They didn't like buy lands in ancient Greece when the last video game came out. So they're not going to have this strong desire to stick around on these lands they've already purchased. And there also aren't typically these kinds of revenue producing mechanisms that some of these metaverses are currently advertising. So it's going to be a little bit different for the teams creating these metaverses. Once they run out of the money from the initial land sales, where does money for the team come from to continue evolving the virtual world? Maybe from royalties, maybe they have built-in royalties anytime anybody sells, any of the parcels from the initial land sale. But is the volume of traffic in the secondary markets going to be enough to sustain these teams, or do the teams dwindle down to a much smaller size to the point that they can't really maintain the virtual worlds? Like, what does this look like long term? What's the sustainability of these teams building out these metaverse projects? In the absence of sufficient royalties from the secondary markets for the NFTs, are there scenarios in which the teams would sort of completely go away once the big money from the land sales has all evaporated? Once that's all been used up, do the teams just kind of disappear? In which case, does the maintenance of the virtual world fall on the community? Are we going to end up with this situation where all of a sudden the team is gone now because there's no more money? Maybe there's not enough traffic. Maybe even if they have royalties in the NFTs, maybe there's not enough traffic in the NFTs. So if the transaction volume in the marketplaces goes down, the team sort of disappears, and now all of a sudden the community is trying to figure out how to find the funds to maintain the virtual world. Because it's not really like a DeFi project. A DeFi protocol gets deployed to the chain and it's kind of there. But with these metaverse projects, there's a virtual world. It's not living on chain. It's living on servers somewhere. And those instances on those servers need to be paid for, and they need to be maintained in certain ways. There's like this ongoing need to provide sustenance for the virtual world. Are these communities going to be scrambling, trying to figure out how to keep these virtual worlds alive once the money from these initial land sales runs out? Is that a scenario that could occur? These are all open questions that I would love to see resolved at some point. In any case, I hope you had a great weekend, and I will talk to you tomorrow.